everyone. This is Mitchie, and welcome back to the Manic Matter podcast. Now, before we start today's episode, I just wanted to start off by saying that the Manic Matter podcast is about to turn a year old now. So I kind of wanted to give everybody who has helped make this podcast what it is a huge thank you. I know that this podcast isn't a huge one, and it's definitely got a lot of progress to make before it's considered, to be as up to par and splendid as, most other podcasts are, but it's still my podcast, and it's still, I still love it. And so I just wanted to give a big thank you to everybody who has made it possible. I want to thank Joe and Sean from the Dark Side of Soul podcast for all the shout outs that they have been giving me over this past year, especially with how supportive they've been, and everybody in the Dokebe chat for their support as well. They have been phenomenal friends, even though, it's just been a short period of time. Thank you guys so much. I also want to thank Tracy Finner. She is what I can quite honestly say the show's number one fan, because every time I post something on Facebook, she is always there giving a like, giving a heart, always making a comment. Even when I've had the hiatuses where I've been in the hospital, she has always been there giving 100% support, even though she's never had to do anything like that. So thank you so much, Tracy. It's, the support like that keeps me doing everything that I am doing. So I know that there's not much that I can give, especially, being as small of a podcast that I am, but I really do hope that you continue to enjoy these episodes, and if there is anything that I can do to make these episodes better, please don't hesitate to let me know. And I also want to give a major thank you to my boyfriend, Brian. You guys heard him in one of my earlier episodes. If you remember listening to the Jeon Tae-il episode, he was the co-host on that one. And here lately, he's also been kind of like a producer. He's been giving all sorts of ideas, like the Mary Meyer episode and the Shipei Poo episode. So a big thank you to him as well. And to all of you who also listen, who may not, give any kind of comments or anything like that, who just kind of listen and give likes and stuff, especially on YouTube. Thank you guys so much. I do pay attention to all of the likes and the downloads. I'm on Podbean kind of daily. I do see, from all the countries and everything where people are downloading from, so it's not unnoticed. I definitely appreciate it, and thank you guys so much for making this podcast what it is. So here's to a year of the Manic Manor podcast, and let us keep going. But let's get into today's episode, shall we? So for today's episode, we are going to go into a case that really has an impact on South Korean history. This is the case of Jeon Tae-il. For any of you guys who are huge fans of the Dark Side of Soul podcast, you have definitely heard of him. He was mentioned in one of the earlier episodes of Dark Side, their On Fire episode, actually. Jeon Tae-il is infamously known as a man who kind of set the standard and set the actions in motion for the labor movement in South Korea. He was like 22 years old at the time that he infamously committed suicide by setting himself on fire, demanding, equality and just fair treatment for factory workers in South Korea. And so we're going to discuss, his background today, kind of talk about where he came from, what he witnessed, and lead up to, his death, and how it had an impact and everything, and how, despite, this happening like 50 years ago, because this was like in the 70s that this happened, even though there's been quite a bit of progress, there's still a lot to be made from his actions. So here we go. Jeon Tae-il was born September 28, 1948 in Daegu, South Korea. Now, of course, 1948 South Korea, his family was less fortunate, and he was one of 3 siblings. Now, his father did work in textiles, and he was a sewer, so that was his trade of choice. And although he was a sewer, he didn't make much money. Now, the family did suffer quite a bit as a result of this, and Tae-il, of course, as he was growing up, had to drop out of elementary school as a result of this, even though he really did love school. And if you remember back when we were talking about the Chaebol episode, during this time that Tae-il was growing up, when he was growing up, we saw Korea, they were trying to recover because, Tae-il was going to be growing up during a point where Korea was going through the Korean War. So, we had the textiles and everything and all this. There was cheap labor with the textiles. So we had the clothes, we had wigs, workers. In turn, they were devoting hours and hours of their day to work towards this quote-unquote miracle on the Han. Or, as the outsiders would call it, the miracle on the Han, because they didn't see it for what it actually was, just the exploitation of the Korean people being forced to work for pretty much just pennies on the dollar. Now, Tae-il's father, for a period of time, did end up getting a job in a private sector, or you can say private sector. It was kind of like a military type of thing. Working for the U.S. military is what they say. But he was kind of mending the military suits for the United States. And they were kind of hopeful for this, so they ended up going to Busan for a little while. And the family had hoped that this was going to be their saving grace. They were going to make money from this. They weren't going to have to worry about living in poverty, but unfortunately, this was, very short-lived because the father did end up getting scammed, and he didn't get the money that he was promised, and the family was very much still struggling. So because of that, they ended up relocating to Seoul, hoping that maybe they could find some sort of work, but finding work in the capital of South Korea was not as easy as they hoped. And there, they still found that they were suffering from periods of homelessness as well. At one point, the family found themselves sleeping under the Yeomcheon Bridge near Seoul Station. And around the time of 1960, they found themselves relocating back to Daegu. And like I said, Tae-il, of course, he did have to drop out of elementary school because the family just could not afford to, have these kids going to school. They had to go to work in order to just let the family get by. And, Tae-il wanted to go to school, he wanted to get an education, he had a strong desire to learn, but it just wasn't in the cards for him. But friends, family, everybody around Tae-il said that he was still a loving person, despite all of these hardships. He was so friendly, he didn't want to kneel to any kind of injustice. He was adamant that you had to do the right thing, and no matter what the struggle was, what was right, what was wrong. So, of course, Tae-il wanted to do what was right for his family. Now, things did not get easier for the family, and as a result of these hardships, the father, of course, did decide to turn his stress and everything to alcohol. He started drinking. And of course, it was left for the mother to turn to begging for food for her children. And of course, the family was not eating for days, and it wasn't uncommon for them to do that. So the family was no stranger to just starving. But that didn't stop the mother from going out there and trying to find work and trying hard to just do what she could to provide for her children. So the mother would go out, she would get the glutinous rice cakes, or red bean porridge, like if you've ever seen Kopboda Namja, Boys Over Flowers. There's that one part of the episode where, what is it, Jandi, she is with her family and they're selling the rice cakes on the side of the road. It probably was something similar like that for the mother. She was selling what she could to try to get a little bit of money to provide for her family. And it didn't work enough for her to buy kind of like a tent house or a pochangmacha, I guess is what you can call it in Korean. Enough to put some kind of roof over the family's head for them to survive for a little bit of the time. And the family was able to get a sewing machine. And so Tae-il's father used that sewing machine to kind of teach Tae-il the methods of how to sew through his childhood. Now, by the time Tae-il was a teenager, we saw that he actually did run away from home and made his way back up to Seoul. And I guess it was because he was just sick of the poverty, or I don't know what it exactly made him want to run away from home. Maybe he wanted to just provide more for his family, just try to get some more money. But we do know that he had a big sense of rightfulness and a sense of just against injustice. So, whatever his reason, he did end up running away from home. Now, he was about 17, 18, and he was working at Pyeonghwa Market. At the time, there was around 800 factories around the Cheonggyecheon, and roughly about 20,000 workers that would work in these factories. And these factories were super cramped, super crowded. But because his father was a sewer, he was able to get I guess you could somewhat say fairly decent job. And he got a job as a foundation assistant called a Shida. And they claim that he got quite a bit of recognition, so he was able to kind of go up in the ranks, you could say, but despite this, he still wasn't paid well, and he was looking around and seeing that things weren't really all that right in these factories. And like I said, these factories, they were very, very crowded, and the pay wasn't all that well either. Like, he was making probably the equivalent of $2, whether that be $2 an hour, or whether that be $2 for the day that he was making. It was not a lot of money. And one other thing that he noticed was the treatment that they were making. Even if he got, some kind of recognition like, hey, good job, that's a nice stitch there. The workers, including him, the experiences that they were having in these factories were less than that of humane. And it was particularly bad with his female coworkers. At one point, he noticed a female coworker coughing up blood at one point on a daily basis. Sewing machines and the tables were lined up so narrowly that hardly anybody could walk through them. There were clothes and not just clothes but fabrics as well that were piled up that were so cramped up and dusty that they could be seen as a fire hazard. And the work hours were up to 14, 15 hours a day. And some of these girls didn't see the sun, or they couldn't move properly. They were hunched over. So that couldn't be good, for their bones, couldn't be good for their backs. And Lord knows how old these girls actually were, so I don't know what the working age rights were back then in the 60s and 70s for South Korea, but like we said, Tae-il had a big sense of, injustice is not right, so he just saw that this was not right. And what was even worse for Tae-il was he saw that the factory workers were keeping these girls up by giving them, all these tonics and medications. So it was essentially just depriving these girls of sleep to keep them going, keep them producing more and more, textiles, more wigs, more this, more that. And it just wasn't good on a human body, and he just thought that this was not fair. So as we said, the workers at this time, with the pay being as shitty as it was said that they were lucky if they got, 3,000 won a month. But after, sending it to their families or paying bills that they needed, they were back at a poverty line. They were lucky if they had anything in their pocket. So they were pretty much working for nothing. And, tuberculosis, if you saw somebody coughing up blood, that was not a good sign. Nosebleeds, jaundice-infused faces, it was awful. And Tae-il, since his childhood, had a sense of right and wrong that was very, very inept. He never knelt to this injustice. He saw that this was unfair, and he felt it so deep in his system, so deep in his bones. And his father, so he went to his father, and his father said that he knew of a labor act that was supposed to protect workers in South Korea. So Tae-il found this act. He bought a copy, I don't know if it was a book or just like a sheet of paper, but he found a copy of this act, and he read this act over. And in this act, he found, workers in Korea were only supposed to work, 8 hours a day, or only up to 48 hours a week. But the reality of what him and his co-workers were going through was much, much darker. And the reality was they were working 14 plus hours a day, 98 hours a week, and they weren't being treated like humans. This was not right at all. How could these factory owners get away with this when there was clearly a law in place? So Tae-il took it upon himself to start studying this act inside and out. So in June of 1969, he decided that if nobody else was going to protect him and his people in these factories, that he was going to have to stand up and do something. So he decided that he was going to start a demonstration, and he named the meeting the Fools Association. And the name came from, their unfair treatment, and it was mainly because they had hardly made a sound up until that day, but they still contained the will to fight and seek justice. And Tae-il was the chairman of this group, and he made it his mission to fight for each of the factory workers that were in these factories so that they could have their rights and they could have fair treatment because they were people too. So he pushed out with his dream, and while he was doing this, he did end up losing his father. His father did pass away during this time. And, the owners of the factory that he worked in found out about this and turned around and fired him because he was being seen as a threat. And so they just turned around and fired him on the spot. So Tae-il is without a job. He's now dealing with the emotional hardship of losing his father, and now he's unable to find work. But that didn't stop him, because he was so heavily involved and devoted to this cause, and he refused to give up because he believed that these workers still deserved to be treated with respect and dignity, like it was just a God-given right. So by August of 1969, he went back to the factory area and began questioning the workers in the factories to figure out what was going on and how the condition in the factories was going, if it had improved any, or if it was still bad, or if it was worsening. And once he collected as much information as he could, he decided he was going to go down to the city hall in the area and was going to meet with the labor supervisor, or at least he attempted to. But when he went to meet with the labor supervisor, it didn't turn out near as much as he hoped it would. Essentially, the supervisor just brushed him off and told him, it's whatever. Ignore it. It's not a big deal. They looked at him like he was just a silly college student protesting, like it's whatever, you're just being stupid. Because he was like a 19, 20-year-old kid at this time. It's just like, whatever. They didn't take him seriously. So, he's obviously disgruntled and frustrated at this point. Now, time goes by and things blow over, and eventually the factory owner does give him his job back as a tailor at the factory. And Tae-il uses this to his advantage to rally hope with his fellow co-workers and form the Samdang Fellowship. And he gathered tailors from 3 of the factories, the Pyeonghwa Market, the Donghwa Market, and the Dongil Market. And in this movement, they chose to bring to light, the truth of the working conditions that they were experiencing to the public. And initially, no one was actually listening to their cries. However, there was one newspaper that was willing to pay attention to what they were doing. There was a reporter that took, mercy and graciousness upon them. And it was that one person alone that was enough to make the group happy and continue their cause. And so, there came along an article about the conditions at the Pyeonghwa Market. And the supervisor got wind of this and was not happy. And immediately sights were set on Tae-il, and there was an outrage about this. And how dare Tae-il bring an embarrassment onto that factory. And this brings us to the day of the protest and the labor movement in the events of November 13th, 1970. The entire atmosphere was severely tense, and there were local police on guard that day. There were workers out there demonstrating for their equal and fair treatment. It was around midday, and there was a fight that soon broke out. In the midst of this fight, Jeon Tae-il had been around the corner in a back alley, and he had doused himself in gasoline with a friend. And the friend helped him to light a match. After that, Tae-il came sprinting into the middle of all of the action, screaming out the infamous line, "We are not machines." And after he had stated that slogan, he collapsed onto the ground. And as his body collapsed onto the ground and burned, a worker came up and took a copy of the Labor Act and tossed it onto his burning body. His body burned with a copy of the act that was supposed to protect these workers from the unfair treatment that they were being subjected to. Soon after, he was taken to a nearby hospital, and I should note that one of the articles that I looked at felt the need to mention that one of his last meals was ramen, because one of the last things that he ever actually said was that he was hungry. And 10 o'clock that evening, he passed away. And actually, him being hungry was not actually the last thing he said. The last thing that he did say was actually to his mother. "Please don't let what I've done here be in vain." And that is so powerful. He was 22 years old and had just committed an act that nobody really thinks of doing, even at such a young age. Self-immolation for a cause that he was so devoted to. Tae-il wanted to change the labor force in Korea for the better, and didn't want his cause to be in vain. And I can only hope, as, time goes on, that his name never gets forgotten for any reason, and that, the next generations, not only in South Korea, but across the world, learn of his bravery and selflessness, because what he did, I don't care who you are or what you may think of what he did, it takes guts to do that. Because he knew that even if he couldn't make a direct change that day himself, what he did somehow would go down in history. So, as a result of his actions, his death did motivate workers to continue fighting for their rights, and labor unions have formed since the 1970s. We saw, unification of university students and some media outlets. And, even some religious officials came together as well. Some movies were created as a result of this. There was one created in 1995 called A Single Spark. Just recently, there was one in 2021. It was an animated movie called Jeon Tae-il, A Flame That Lives On. Now, I've not seen either movie, but I'm sure they are pretty decent movies if you do want to give them a chance to go see them. Now, there is a statue of Jeon Tae-il. It's located at Jeongno-oga in Jeongno-gu, Seoul, South Korea. I believe that's near Cheonggi-cheon, where all of this took place. There is also a memorial museum as well, I believe. And anytime there's, labor protests or anything like that, I do know that there are people that go to the statue of Jeon Tae-il because he is known as, kind of a founding father, if you will, when it comes to, civil rights, when it comes to any kind of labor movement. But that is, in short, the story of Jeon Tae-il. If you guys have, any comments or any additional information that you would like to add on to his story, please feel free to do so, because this is, a very heavy story, and this is a very important person in history, not just in South Korea, but for the world as well. If you have any other stories that you would like for me to say or do or add on to the podcast, please feel free to let me know. You can reach out to me at manicmanorpodcast@gmail.com. You can also reach out at Facebook or Instagram at Manic Manor Podcast. I hope you guys have a fantastic week. And once again, thank you guys so much for a fantastic year on this podcast. And here's to many more. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. And until the next episode, bye-bye.